The little girl's voice cut through the morning air like a blade through silk, sweet and devastating all at once. Papa woke up smiling today. 7-year-old Clara Holloway stood in the doorway of the Red Mesa General Store, her brown braids slightly undone, her calico dress wrinkled from sleep, and her dark eyes wide and searching. She was not looking at her father. She was not looking at the floorboards or the shelves stacked with dry goods and barrels of flour. She was looking directly at Louisa Talbot, who stood behind the counter with a jar of pickled beets in her hands, and her heart suddenly hammering so hard she was certain the whole town of Redrock Crossing, Texas, could hear it. The year was 1878, and the October wind outside was already turning cold off the plateau, pushing dust through the gaps in the store's wooden siding. But in that moment, Louisa felt as though every last breath of air had been sucked clean out of the world. Clara looked straight at her, not with the innocent curiosity of a child who had simply wandered in for a peppermint stick, with something older, something that understood far more than any 7-year-old had a right to understand. It was a look that said, "I know why he is smiling, and I know it has everything to do with you, and I need you to know that I know." Louisa set the jar of pickled beets down very carefully so that it would not shatter the way she felt like she might. For 3 months, she had told herself that what was happening between her and John Holloway was nothing, a neighborly thing, a man who brought his daughter in twice a week for supplies and always lingered a little longer than was necessary, a man who asked how her day was going with the kind of quiet sincerity that made the question feel like something sacred. A man who had lost his wife 2 years ago and still carried the grief of it in the set of his shoulders like a stone. He had decided he deserved to carry forever. She had told herself she was not falling in love with him. She had told herself that lie every single morning for 12 weeks. And now his daughter was standing in her doorway telling her, without saying a single word beyond those 6, that the lie was finished. Louisa Talbot had come to Redrock Crossing, Texas in the spring of 1878 with $43, a small leather trunk, and a secret that she had sworn to herself she would never tell another living soul. She had come from Richmond, Virginia, which was still in the slow, aching process of rebuilding itself after the war, still carrying its own grief in the set of its old stone buildings, and the faces of men who had come home from battlefields missing pieces of themselves they would never get back. She had been 26 years old when she stepped off the stagecoach into the red dust of Redrock Crossing, and she had looked at the raw, unfinished streets and the wide, blazing sky and thought, "This is far enough. Nobody from Richmond will ever come looking for me here." And for a while, she had been right. Redrock Crossing was a town in the middle of finding out what it wanted to be. It had a sheriff named Cal Briggs who was honest and tired in equal measure. It had a saloon called the Desert Rose that served bad whiskey and occasional trouble. It had a church whose roof leaked during the summer monsoons, a livery stable, a blacksmith, and until 6 months before Louisa arrived, it had not had a general store. The previous owner had packed up and moved north to Kansas, chasing rumors of better money in the cattle trade, and left behind a building with solid walls and a good wood floor that nobody seemed to know what to do with. Louisa had used 38 of her $43 to rent it for the first 3 months, and she had set about building a business with the same focused, slightly desperate energy of a woman who needed to be too busy to think about the thing she was running from. She was good at it. It turned out that Louisa Talbot, who had grown up in a merchant family in Richmond before the war burned everything her father had built to the ground, understood commerce the way some people understood music, instinctively and with a kind of love for it. She knew how to stock shelves so that the things people needed most were at eye level, and the things they wanted but did not need were placed just close enough to the door that impulse could do its work. She knew how to extend credit to the right people and tactfully decline the wrong ones without making enemies of them. She knew that the women of Redrock Crossing needed things the previous store had never thought to carry: good quality needles that did not bend, proper medicinal herbs, writing paper that did not dissolve when a pen touched it. Within 2 months, the Talbot General Store was the most reliable establishment in Redrock Crossing, and Louisa had gone from a stranger with a secret to a fixture of the town. John Holloway walked in for the first time on a Tuesday in July, and he walked in the way he apparently did everything, quietly, without announcement, as though he was slightly apologetic for taking up space in the world. He was 32 years old, tall, with dark hair that had started to show the faintest threads of silver at his temples, and the kind of lean, sun-weathered build that came from years of working land that fought you for every acre. He had a small ranch 3 miles east of town, 160 acres he had claimed under the Homestead Act 4 years prior, and he ran cattle on it with the help of one hired hand named Oscar, a man of 60 who had been a Buffalo soldier, and had decided that raising cattle in West Texas was a quieter life than the alternatives. John had introduced himself simply, in the way of a man who did not assume his name required explanation, and he had bought cornmeal and coffee, and a small paper bag of lemon drops that Louisa had just stocked because she had a hunch children in Redrock Crossing were undersupplied with sweetness. "My daughter's partial to these," he said, holding up the bag. "How old is she?" Louisa had asked, because it was the natural thing to ask. 7 in September, he said, and there was something in his voice when he said it that was tender and also painful. The way you say the age of someone you love when they're growing up is both a joy and a reminder that time is moving with or without your permission. He had paid, tucked the lemon drops in his shirt pocket, and left. And then he had come back on Friday, and the Friday after that, and the Tuesday after that, until his twice-weekly visits became as regular as the sun crossing the plateau, and Louisa had started noticing things about him that she had no business noticing. The way he always held the door open on his way out, even though there was nobody behind him, just the habit of a man raised to hold doors open. The way he listened when she spoke, not waiting for his turn to talk the way most men did, but actually listening, the way you listen to something that matters to you. The way he sometimes brought Clara with him, and the way Clara watched her father, the way children watch parents they are privately a little worried about, with a mix of love and careful attention, checking him like a small, devoted doctor monitoring a patient they have decided to cure through sheer force of will. Louisa had noticed all of it, and she had told herself it meant nothing, and she had been lying through her teeth. On the morning that Clara appeared in her doorway with that devastating announcement, Louisa had already been awake for 2 hours. She had lain in her small room above the store in the blue-black dark before dawn and thought about John Holloway in a way that frightened her with its specificity. She had thought about the conversation they had had the previous Friday, when he had stayed until almost closing time, and they had talked about everything and nothing, about whether the winter was going to come hard this year, and what a man owed to a piece of land, and whether there was a meaningful difference between stubbornness and faith. She had thought about the moment just before he left, when he had paused in the doorway and said quietly, "Louisa, I think this is one of the better parts of my week," and then gone, as though the admission had surprised him as much as it had her. She had thought about that sentence in the dark before dawn, and she had felt the warm, terrifying current of something she had been trying very hard not to feel. And then Clara had arrived at 7 in the morning with her braids half undone and her dark eyes full of ancient knowing, and she had said that her father was smiling, and she had looked straight at Louisa, and the lie was done. "Good morning, Clara," Louisa said, because she was a woman who defaulted to manners when she did not know what else to do. "You are up early." "Papa is bringing the wagon around," Clara said, stepping fully inside and approaching the counter with the proprietary ease of a child who has decided she is welcome somewhere. "He said we needed flour and salt, and he thought you might have gotten in those green apples you mentioned." "I did," Louisa said. "They came in yesterday with the supply wagon from El Paso." Clara looked at her steadily. He really did smile. When he woke up, He was already smiling before he even opened his eyes all the way. Louisa did not say anything to that. "He does not usually do that," Clara continued, in the tone of a small scientist presenting her findings. "Usually he wakes up like he is remembering something heavy." The honesty of children was a particular kind of knife, Louisa thought. It cut clean. "Clara," she said carefully, "your papa is a good man." "I know," Clara said simply. "Are you going to let him be happy?" The question landed with a weight that was completely out of proportion to the size of the person asking it. Louisa stared at this 7-year-old girl with her lemon-drop wisdom and her undone braids, and she felt something crack open in her chest that she had been keeping nailed firmly shut for a very long time. Before she could answer, the wagon pulled up outside, and through the store's front window she could see John Holloway climbing down from the seat, his movements easy and unhurried. His face turned toward the store with an expression she had not let herself read clearly before, but was reading now with absolute clarity. He was looking at the store the way you look at a place you are glad to be going. He pushed through the door and stopped when he saw his daughter at the counter, and then he looked at Louisa, and something passed between the three of them in that small, dusty, pickle jar-scented room that felt enormous. "Morning," he said to Louisa. "Good morning," she said. Clara looked between them with the expression of a person who has arranged a difficult thing and is waiting to see if it takes. That was the beginning of the ending of Louisa Talbot's very careful, very necessary lie. But understanding that the lie was finished and actually telling the truth were two entirely different things, and Louisa was a woman who had reasons, deep and serious reasons, for the distance she had built between herself and the people of Redrock Crossing. The secret she had carried from Richmond was not a small one. It was the kind of secret that could rearrange a person's entire life if it came to light in the wrong way, and she had spent the better part of the last 2 years making sure it did not come to light at all. Her name was Louisa Talbot, and she had kept that name, because it was her real name, her mother's family name that she had taken when she was 18, and decided to stop using the name she had been given at birth. The name she had been given at birth was Louisa Beaumont, daughter of Richard Beaumont, who had been a very wealthy and a very corrupt man, who had made his money before the war through means that were legal on the books and monstrous in practice, and who had continued to make money after the war through means that were neither legal nor anything else remotely defensible. Her father was, in 1878, wanted by federal authorities in 3 states for fraud, land theft, and a collection of financial crimes that had left hundreds of families, including many freedmen who had been trying to build new lives in the years after emancipation, utterly ruined. Louisa had watched him do it. She had understood, by the time she was 22, exactly what her father was and what he had done. And she had made a choice that had cost her everything she had grown up with, every comfort and every connection. She had gone to the federal authorities in Richmond, and she had told them what she knew. It had not been enough to put him behind bars. Her father was slippery in the way that only truly wealthy, truly ruthless men could be, and he had lawyers who were paid extremely well to make evidence disappear. But it had been enough to put him on notice, and it had been enough to make him aware that his daughter had betrayed him, and her father was not the kind of man who forgave betrayals. She had left Richmond 18 months after that conversation with the federal investigators, after 2 attempts had been made on her life that she could not prove were connected to her father, but absolutely were, and she had gone west because west was where a person went when they needed to become someone new without entirely giving up who they were. She had never told anyone in Redrock Crossing any of this. She had no way of knowing whether her father knew where she was. She had no way of knowing whether the danger had followed her or stayed behind in Richmond where she had left it. What she did know was that getting close to people, letting them matter to her, meant that they could be used against her, and she had decided very firmly that she would not allow that. And then John Holloway had walked into her store with a bag of lemon drops for his motherless daughter, And 3 months later his daughter was asking her if she was going to let her father be happy. And the very careful architecture of Louisa's protected solitude was showing cracks that she did not know how to seal. John stayed for nearly an hour that morning. He helped himself to the small wooden stool that lived behind the counter without being invited, because he had been invited so many times before that the invitation was simply understood. And he talked to Louisa while she stocked shelves and wrote out her weekly orders and wrapped up the green apples for Clara, who sat on the store's front step eating one and watching the horses tied at the rail with the satisfied air of a child who has accomplished something. He talked about the cattle, about the way the east pasture fence was going to need serious work before winter, about a letter he had gotten from his brother in Colorado who was thinking about coming south in the spring. He talked the way he always talked with her, comfortably and without performance, as though she was a person he had already decided he did not need to impress. At some point Louisa set down the tin of beeswax she was shelving and said, without quite planning to, "John, can I ask you something direct?" He looked at her with those steady dark eyes of his and said, "You can ask me anything, Louisa." She had meant to ask something small, something manageable. Instead, what came out was, "What is it that you want from me?" The question filled up the store like a held breath. John did not look away from her. He did not perform discomfort or pretend not to understand what she was asking. He turned the brim of his hat slowly in his hands. A gesture she had come to understand was what he did when he was choosing his words with care. And then he said, "I want to know you better, more than we know each other now. I want to know what makes you laugh, because I think you do not laugh enough, and I want to know what it is that sits behind your eyes when you think no one is looking at you." Louisa's heart did something it had not done in years. It simply opened the way a door opens on a warm morning, not because someone forced it, but because it wanted to. "That is a complicated thing to want," she said. "I know," he said. "I am a patient man." She looked at him for a long moment. "John, there are things about me, things from before I came here, that are not simple." "I did not figure you were simple," he said. "That was not one of the things I thought about you." "They are serious things," she said. "Things that could put people I care about in a difficult position." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, Clara had moved on from the front step and was apparently trying to befriend one of the horses tied at the rail, crooning something low and patient at it. "Louisa," John said finally, "I buried my wife 2 years ago come November. She died of a fever that went too fast for anyone to catch it. I had 3 days between the morning she complained of a headache and the morning I was digging a hole in the earth for her. My daughter was 5 years old." He stopped. "I am not telling you this because I want you to feel sorry for me. I am telling you because I have learned something from it. Life is short enough and hard enough that spending it careful of things that have not happened yet is a waste of something precious." Louisa felt the sting of tears behind her eyes and blinked them back with the ferocity of a woman who had decided some years ago that she would not cry in front of people, because crying in front of people meant opening a door she needed to keep closed. "I will think about what you said," she told him. It was not what he was hoping for, she could see that, but he accepted it with the grace of a man who had learned that you cannot rush the things that matter. He collected Clara, tipped his hat, and drove the wagon back down the red dust road toward the ranch. Louisa stood in the middle of her store for a long time afterward, surrounded by sacks of flour and tins of coffee and jars of pickled beets, thinking about what it would mean to tell John Holloway the truth. She thought about it for 3 days, and on the 4th day something happened that forced her hand. A stranger rode into Redrock Crossing on a Thursday afternoon, on a horse that was too good for the saddle it was wearing, which was a detail that Louisa's merchant eye caught, and filed away with a sense of unease before she had consciously understood why. He was a man of about 45, broad through the shoulders, with a face that was professionally friendly in a way that experienced people recognized as the kind of friendly that was a tool rather than a feeling. He wore a dark coat that was expensive and dusty, and he came into the store shortly after noon, looked around with the particular unhurried thoroughness of someone taking inventory of more than the shelves, and then brought a small handful of items to the counter. "Miss Talbot," he said, not asking, stating. The cold that moved through Louisa was immediate and absolute. "That is my name," she said, because she was a woman who could keep her voice level when everything inside her was screaming. "Name's Decker," he said. "I work for your father." She held his gaze. She did not run, because running would have accomplished nothing and would have told him everything he needed to know about how frightened she was. "I do not have a father," she said. Decker smiled the smile of a man who had been told exactly what to expect and found it confirmed. "Mr. Beaumont sends his regards. He also sends a message. He says the business with the federal investigators in Richmond was an embarrassing episode, but he is a forgiving man, and he wants you to know that all can be put behind you both if you come home." "Tell him I am home," Louisa said. The smile remained, but the eyes behind it did something that was not smiling at all. "That would be a mistake, Miss Talbot. Your father is not a patient man. He has been generous in giving you this much time to come to your senses. He would prefer not to have to be less generous." "Get out of my store," Louisa said, quietly and clearly. Decker picked up the items he had brought to the counter, a tin of tobacco and a box of matches, and paid for them without comment. He went to the door, paused with his hand on the frame, and said, without turning around, "You have built something nice here. It would be a shame." And then he was gone. Louisa stood absolutely still for 60 seconds after he left. Then she went to the back room, sat down on a flour sack, and allowed herself to be terrified for exactly 10 minutes, because she had learned that 10 minutes of actual feeling was always more useful than an indefinite period of suppressed feeling. At the end of 10 minutes, she was still frightened, but she was also clear. Decker being here meant her father knew where she was. It also meant, for the moment, that her father was still trying the soft approach before moving to the hard one. She had perhaps a few days, maybe a week, before the calculus changed. She thought about packing her trunk. She had done it before from Richmond and she had survived. She could do it again. And then she thought about John Holloway waking up smiling for the first time in 2 years, and Clara looking at her with those ancient dark eyes, and she felt something shift in her with a finality that surprised her. She was done running, but she was also not a fool, and she knew that being done running did not mean the problem had gone away. It meant she needed help, and she needed it from someone she could trust, and in Redrock Crossing, Texas in October of 1878, that meant going to the sheriff, and she realized with a clarity that was equal parts terrifying and necessary, going to John. She went to Sheriff Cal Briggs first, because that was the sensible order of operations. Briggs was a thin man in his late 40s with a careful mind and the unhurried manner of a lawman who had learned that most problems took longer to solve than the person in trouble wanted them to. He listened to her full account without interruption, which she appreciated, and then he sat back in his chair behind the scarred desk and said, "Your father is Richard Beaumont." "Yes, I have heard the name," Briggs said slowly. "From a circular that came through here last year out of the federal marshal's office. The man has reach, Miss Talbot. I know. Decker is a name I have heard in connection with things I would rather not have in my town," Briggs said. He drummed his fingers on the desk once. "I can ask him to move on. I can tell him there is no reason for him to be in Redrock Crossing and that I will be watching him closely. That may buy you time, but I want you to understand that if your father has decided he wants you back in Richmond, a small-town sheriff is not going to be his primary obstacle." "I understand," Louisa said. "I am not asking you to fight my battles, Sheriff. I am asking you to know what is happening in case it becomes something you need to deal with officially." Briggs nodded, clearly respecting her for that. "I will ride out this afternoon and have a word with Mr. Decker. You should also know that John Holloway has vouched for you in this town more times than you probably know, and there are people here who would not be quick to let an outsider cause you trouble." Louisa had not known that. She sat with it for a moment, the image of John Holloway quietly, unasked, telling people in this town that she was good people, and then she thanked the sheriff and went back to her store. That evening, as the sun went red and massive behind the western mesa and turned the dust in the street to something that looked almost precious, she closed up the shop and walked the 3 miles to John Holloway's ranch. She had never done it before. She had never gone to him. It had always been him coming to her, in the natural, patient way he had, and she had accepted the visits with the carefully maintained posture of a woman who was pleased to see him, but had not gone out of her way to be. Walking those 3 miles in the cooling October air, watching the shadows of the cedars lengthen across the road, she felt the last of her carefully constructed walls doing something she had not been sure they could do. They were not falling. They were just becoming optional, the way a coat becomes optional once you have decided you are not cold anymore. She heard Clara before she saw the house. The child was singing something to herself in the near pasture, some half-remembered tune that wandered pleasantly off-key. John was at the fence line of the same pasture, doing exactly what he had told her he needed to do, working on the east fence, hammering a new post with the steady, economical strokes of a man who has done a particular physical task enough times that his body does it without requiring much from his mind. He saw her coming along the road and stopped hammering. She reached the fence and they looked at each other across it in the fading red light, and Louisa thought that there was something appropriate about a fence between them as she prepared to tell him the thing that might make him understand at last why she had kept one there all along. "You walked 3 miles, he said. "I did. That is either very good news or very bad news." "It is both," she said. "John, I need to tell you something, several things. And I need you to listen all the way to the end before you decide what you think." He set his hammer down on the fence post with a deliberate gentleness and said, "Clara, come in and start the supper things, please." Clara emerged from the pasture like a small ghost in the dusk, gave Louisa a look of pure, undisguised hope, and went toward the house. John opened the fence gate and came through it, and they walked to the 2 wooden chairs that sat on the porch in the particular domestic arrangement of chairs that have been lived in over years and have arranged themselves into a conversation. And Louisa told him everything. She told him about her father, about what he was and what he had done and who he had done it to. She told him about the men whose land had been stolen, the families driven to ruin, the freedmen who had come to Richard Beaumont's offices in Richmond with their carefully saved money and their dreams of land, and had walked away with nothing because her father had sold them fraudulent deeds to properties he did not own. She told him about the moment she had decided she could not stay silent, the night she had sat at her father's dinner table and watched him laugh at a story about one of his lawyers tearing apart a widow's case in court, and felt something inside her go very still and very clear. She told him about the federal investigators and what they had taken her testimony and then not been able to do with it. She told him about the 2 attempts on her life, and she told him about leaving Richmond, and she told him about Decker. John sat in his chair through all of it and listened the way he always listened to her, with his whole attention and without the restlessness of someone waiting for their opportunity to speak. When she was finished, the dark had fully come down over the mesa and the sky was enormous with stars, and the coyotes had started their evening conversation out in the hills. "Decker is in town now," John said. "He was this afternoon. The sheriff went to speak with him. Cal is a good man," John said. "He will do what he can." He was quiet for a moment. "Louisa, what Decker said to you about it being a shame if something happened to what you built, that was a threat." "Yes. Against your store. Against anything, I think. He was being general." John said nothing for a moment, and then he turned to look at her in the starlight, and his expression had the quiet intensity of a man who has come to a decision that he intends to stand behind. "You are not going back to Richmond," he said. It was not a question. "No," she said. "And you are not leaving Redrock Crossing." "No," she said again, and as she said it she understood it for the first time as a fully committed thing, not a position she hoped to maintain but a choice she had made. "Then we have a problem to address," he said, and I would very much like to help you address it if you will allow me." "It is not your problem," she said. "Louisa," he said, and his voice was very quiet and very direct, "I am going to say something, and I would like you to receive it in the spirit in which it is intended. I have been in love with you since approximately the second time you explained to me why the position of goods on a store shelf is a form of conversation with the customer. I am aware that I have been moving at the pace of a man walking through deep water, but I believe you needed me to move at that pace, and I am not sorry for it. What I am saying is that your problems are already my problems, and they have been for some time, whether you agreed to that or not." Louisa looked at the stars for a moment because she needed somewhere to put her eyes that was not his face while she managed what was happening in her chest. "You could be in danger," she said. "I have been in danger before," he said. "I ranched in Comanche territory before the reservation years. I survived. I can handle a hired man from Richmond. My father is not a man you should take lightly." "I am not taking him lightly," John said. "I am taking him seriously enough to not let him win." Louisa turned and looked at him then, directly, without the protective instinct of the last 3 months. She looked at his face and his steady eyes and the way he was sitting in his chair like a man who was not going anywhere, and she felt the last piece of the wall come down not with a crash but with something like a sigh. "Clara asked me this morning if I was going to let you be happy," she said. Something moved across John Holloway's face that she had never seen there before. Something warm and also wounded and also full of the particular hope of a man who had stopped expecting good things and was suddenly faced with the possibility of one. "She is too smart for her age," he said. "She gets it from her father," Louisa said. The silence between them was different from the silence that had lived there before. Before, the silence had been the space where the things they were not saying to each other lived. Now it was just silence, the comfortable kind, the kind that two people who understand each other can share without its being a problem. John reached across the small distance between their chairs and put his hand over hers on the armrest, and she turned her hand over and held his. They sat like that in the starlight for a long time, listening to the coyotes and the wind in the cedar, until Clara appeared in the doorway of the house and announced with great authority that supper was ready and it was going to get cold. The next morning, the situation with Decker moved faster than Louisa had hoped. Sheriff Briggs came to the store at 8 in the morning with his hat in his hands and the expression of a man who is about to give news that is better than expected, but not as good as you would like. "Decker rode out last night," he said. "I watched him go myself past the eastern road marker." "East," Louisa said. "Toward San Angelo," Briggs said, "which means he is likely heading to a telegraph office since we do not have one to report back to your father, and tell him I did not come willingly." "That would be my reading of it," Briggs said. "Miss Talbot, I want to be straight with you. I have sent a wire of my own from Decker's Pass when I rode out early this morning. There is a federal marshal's office in San Antonio that I have a contact at, a man named Foster, and I have explained the situation. Given that your father is already on their books, they may want to move on this." Louisa felt something that was not quite hope but was adjacent to it. How long would that take? Could be a week, could be longer. These things move slowly unless someone lights a fire under them. He put his hat back on. "In the meantime, I would suggest not being alone more than you can help it." She told John what Briggs had said when he came in that Tuesday morning. Clara was with him, as she usually was on Tuesdays when the local schoolteacher did not hold lessons, and Clara sat in her usual spot on the counter eating a lemon drop and processing the adult conversation with the alert, cataloging intelligence of a child who has decided to understand the world rather than be sheltered from it. John listened and then said, "Oscar is going to come help in the store for the next few days." "I do not need a guard," Louisa said. "Oscar is 60 years old and his back gives him trouble," John said mildly. "He would appreciate the easier work for a few days, and I would appreciate knowing you are not alone. Those are two things that happen to coincide." "That is a very diplomatic way to say you are going to post someone with me," Louisa said. "I have been working on being diplomatic," John said. "Clara tells me I am improving." Clara confirmed this with a sage nod. Oscar arrived the following morning, a compact, silver-haired man with a military bearing and a way of standing in a room that made the room feel safer. He had brought a book, which he read in the corner on the stool, and he was unfailingly polite to the customers and quietly, unthreateningly present in a way that Louisa found she was actually grateful for, even though she did not say so. He and Louisa got along exceptionally well. He was a man who had seen a great deal of the world's cruelty and had arrived at a place on the other side of it that was neither bitter nor naively optimistic but simply honest, and she recognized in him a quality she tried to cultivate in herself. "John is a good man," Oscar said to her on the second afternoon without preamble from his corner with his book. "He does not always know what to do with being one." "What do you mean?" Louisa asked. "He thinks he is supposed to need less than he does," Oscar said. "His wife dying did that to him. He thinks need is a weakness." "It is not," Louisa said. "No," Oscar agreed and went back to his book. On the 5th day after Decker's departure, two things happened in quick succession. The first was that a letter arrived for Louisa on the stage from San Antonio. It was from the federal marshal's office, forwarded through Briggs, and it informed her that Marshal Thomas Foster was aware of the situation and had active proceedings in motion against Richard Beaumont that had, in the past month, gained significant new evidence from a source that the letter did not identify, but that had given the marshal's office what they needed to issue a federal warrant. Louisa read the letter 3 times, each time feeling something loosen in her chest that had been tight for 2 years. The second thing that happened was that 2 men she did not recognize rode into Redrock Crossing from the east, tied their horses at the saloon, and were spotted by Sheriff Briggs speaking with the saloon owner in a way that the saloon owner, who was not an unintelligent man, found concerning enough to send his barman to the sheriff's office with a quiet word. Briggs came to the store that evening with the news. "They are not Decker," he said, "but they have the same look about them. Men hired for a purpose." "My father did not wait for Decker's report," Louisa said. "Apparently not." Briggs looked at Oscar, who had put down his book and was standing. "I will get John," Oscar said. John arrived within the hour, having ridden in from the ranch fast enough that his horse was breathing hard. He came into the store and looked at Louisa first, checking her the way you check something you are worried about, and then he looked at Briggs. Briggs laid it out. 2 men, unknown, in town at the Desert Rose. No direct action yet, but their presence was clearly connected. "They are here to frighten her," John said. "Or to wait for an opportunity," Briggs said. "I do not have legal cause to run them out yet. They have not done anything." "Yet," John said. "Yet," Briggs agreed. It was Oscar who said, quietly and practically, "Miss Talbot, I think tonight you should not be above the store alone." Louisa looked at John. "Clara is at Mrs. Hewitt's," John said, referring to the schoolteacher who took Clara on irregular evenings when the ranch work ran long. "She is fine there for tonight. I will stay." "In the store," Louisa said. "In the store," John agreed, with the faint beginning of a smile that acknowledged the careful propriety of the distinction. It was not a romantic evening, by any conventional measure. John slept on the settle in the back room of the store with his rifle close to hand, and Louisa slept in her room upstairs, and nothing happened in the night except that at 2 in the morning Louisa heard the settle creak as John shifted, and she lay in her bed listening to the small sound of another person breathing somewhere below her and felt, despite everything, an enormous and inexplicable peace. In the morning, there was news. A telegram had come in the night to Briggs from Marshal Foster in San Antonio. The federal warrant for Richard Beaumont had been formally executed. Her father had been apprehended at his home in Richmond. The 2 men in the saloon were, when Briggs went to inform them of this development, suddenly very interested in riding back the way they had come, and they did so before noon. Louisa stood in the middle of her store and read the telegram that Briggs brought over, and she read it once, and then she read it again, and then she put it down on the counter and pressed both hands flat against the wood and breathed. the hidden threat that had shadowed the last 2 years of her life, that had followed her from Richmond to this red dust town at the edge of the plateau, that had kept her from sleeping fully and trusting freely and letting herself want anything she could not afford to lose, was gone. Her father was in federal custody. She was free. John came in at noon. He had been at the ranch in the morning because the cattle needed tending regardless of anything else, and he had heard about the telegram from Oscar, who had heard from Briggs, and he had come in with his hat in his hands and a look on his face that was asking a question he did not know how to form into words. "It is over," Louisa said. "The warrant came through," he said. "He is in custody." "The men who were here left this morning." She looked at him. "It is over, John." He crossed the store in 3 strides and took her face in his hands and kissed her. And Louisa Talbot, who had kept herself armored and careful and sealed against exactly this for 2 years, who had told herself every morning that she could not afford to want this, kissed him back with everything she had been holding in reserve since the Tuesday morning in July when he walked through her door with lemon drops in his pocket. When they broke apart, she was laughing, which surprised them both. "What?" he said, smiling because her laugh was contagious. "I do not know," she said. "I think I am happy." "Good," he said. "You should be happy more often. It suits you." She pushed lightly at his chest with both hands, and he caught her hands and held them, and they stood in the middle of the general store grinning at each other like people who have been through something difficult together and come out the other side into sunlight. "John," she said. "Yes. I think I have been in love with you for most of the summer, and I have been spectacularly stupid about admitting it." He laughed then, a real laugh, the full and genuine kind. "You were not stupid. You were careful. There is a difference. Clara would say I was slow." "Clara says a lot of things," he said. They brought Clara home from Mrs. Hewitt's that afternoon, and Clara arrived in the yard of the ranch to find her father and Louisa standing at the fence where this had all begun. Not on opposite sides of it this time, but on the same side. Clara looked at them both with her ancient dark eyes, assessed the situation in the way of a child who has been quietly working toward exactly this outcome for 2 months, and then went inside to see about supper with the dignified satisfaction of a job well done. The weeks that followed were the best weeks of Louisa's life, and she thought that with a clarity that surprised her, because she had not expected to be the kind of person who could say something like that and mean it without reservation. The store continued to do well. The green apples from El Paso sold out in 3 days. She ordered a second shipment and then began writing to a distributor in Fort Worth about a more reliable supply arrangement. She hired a young woman named Pearl Davis, 17 and quick-minded, as a part-time assistant, because she found that she wanted some of her time for things other than stock keeping and ledgers. Things like riding out to the ranch on Sunday afternoons. Clara had apparently decided, with the full commitment of a child who does nothing halfway, that Louisa was going to be part of her life, and she set about including her in it with a thoroughness that was both moving and occasionally overwhelming. She showed Louisa the corner of the east pasture where she had found an arrowhead, explained with great authority the character differences between the 4 horses in the stable, and dragged her through every room of the ranch house in a tour that was equal parts information and implicit argument for the house's potential. "It needs curtains," Clara told her, standing in the main room with her arms crossed, surveying the bare windows with the critical eye of a domestic architect. "It has curtains," John said from the kitchen. "Those are not curtains," Clara said. "Those are apologies for curtains." Louisa laughed, and John caught her eye over his daughter's head, and the look that passed between them was the particular look of 2 people who have discovered that they find the same things funny, which is one of the more underrated foundations of love. They talked, in the way of people who are learning each other properly, about everything. About the war and what it had done to the country they had both grown up in. About what it meant to build something in a place that was still deciding what it was going to be. About Clara's education, and whether the territorial schools were going to improve any time soon. a subject on which both Louisa and John felt strongly. He told her about his wife, Ellen, who had been a woman of great warmth and sharp humor, and he told it without the devastating weight it had carried before, not because the grief was gone, but because he had found a way to hold it that did not require him to stop living. Louisa listened to his descriptions of Ellen with the attentiveness of someone who understood that loving a man meant honoring what had shaped him, including the losses. She told him more about her father, the details she had not included in the first telling, the smaller things about what it had been like to grow up in that house, and to slowly understand, over years, what she was growing up in the middle of. He listened without judgment, and without the particular male discomfort that sometimes made men try to fix things that did not want fixing and simply needed to be heard. "You were brave," he told her, "going to the authorities when you knew what it would cost you." "I was terrified," she said. "That is not the opposite of brave," he said. In November, a letter came from the federal marshal's office in San Antonio. Richard Beaumont had entered a guilty plea to charges of fraud and land theft in exchange for a reduced sentence, and he would be serving 9 years in a federal penitentiary. The letter also mentioned that the legal process of compensation for defrauded landowners was being established, which did not return what had been taken, but was at least an acknowledgment of what was owed. Louisa read the letter and felt something settle in her, not triumph. She was past wanting triumph over her father, but a kind of resolution, a closing of a door. She wrote back to the marshal's office asking for the list of defrauded parties in her father's case, because she had a small thought that had been growing in the back of her mind about what she might be able to do with the store's increasing profits that would be more useful than simply accumulating them. She showed John the letter, and then she told him about the thought. "There are families on that list who lost everything," she said. "Freedmen mostly, who came to my father thinking they were buying land and were given worthless paper. Some of them might have come west, might be trying to start over in places like this." She was quiet for a moment. "I cannot fix what he did, but I can do something." John looked at her for a long moment with that expression she had come to know very well, the one that meant he was feeling something large and did not want to diminish it by being hasty with words. "That is a good thing," he said finally. "It might not amount to much," she said. "It is still a good thing," he said. He proposed to her on a Saturday in December, not in the store and not at the ranch, but on the road between the two, in the spot where the red mesa caught the evening light and turned the whole world briefly the color of fire. Because he had timed it deliberately. He told her afterward, because he wanted her to know that he had thought about it and had chosen the moment, and had meant it as the specific and considered thing it was. He had gotten down from his horse and helped her down from hers, and he had said, without preamble, because he was a man who did not believe in approaching important things sideways, "Louisa, I want to marry you. I want to spend whatever years I have left in this world making a life with you, and I want Clara to have a mother who is as brave and as honest and as relentlessly good at shelving goods as you are." Louisa had laughed so hard at the last part that he had stood there grinning with his hat in his hands while she composed herself, and then she had said yes, and the mesa had burned around them in the December light. They were married in January of 1879, in the church whose roof still leaked but which had been patched sufficiently for winter, by the Reverend Caswell, who had the distinction of being the only ordained minister within 40 miles, and who performed the ceremony with a warmth that suggested he was genuinely moved by the occasion. The whole of Redrock Crossing came, or most of it. Sheriff Briggs was there, looking less tired than usual. Oscar sat in the front pew with his hat on his knee, and the expression of a man at an event he is privately very glad about. Pearl Davis threw rice with a magnificent lack of restraint. Clara stood beside her father in a new dress that she and Louisa had made together over 3 evenings, blue calico, her braids done properly for once, and watched the ceremony with an expression that managed to be simultaneously the most serious and the most joyful thing Louisa had ever seen on a human face. When the Reverend pronounced them man and wife and John turned to her and kissed her, Clara broke into the kind of applause that is produced only by children who have been waiting for something for a very long time and are pleased to see it finally arrive. They moved Louisa's things to the ranch that same afternoon. She kept the store, of course, with Pearl as the daily manager and Louisa coming in for the books and the ordering, and the arrangement worked well because Pearl had turned out to be genuinely talented, and because the store was Louisa's creation in a way that felt important to preserve. The ranch house got the curtains that Clara had been campaigning for, real ones, made from a deep gold fabric that Louisa had been quietly saving behind the counter for exactly this purpose. John hung them himself, up a ladder with Clara supervising from below and Louisa watching from the doorway, and when the last one was in place and the afternoon light came through the gold cloth and filled the main room with the color of autumn, Clara made a satisfied sound that was almost identical to the one she made when she finished a particularly difficult arithmetic problem. "Good," she said, in the tone of a project completed. The winter of 1879 was hard but not cruel. The snow came twice down from the plateau, enough to make the pasture beautiful and the fence work difficult, and John and Oscar spent cold mornings mending line, while Louisa ran the household with the same organized efficiency she brought to the store, and the ranch acquired the particular warmth of a place where people are genuinely glad to be at the end of the day. Clara was thriving. Louisa had quietly started supplementing the territorial school's instruction in the evenings, reading with Clara and doing arithmetic, and Clara had taken to it with the hungry enthusiasm of a child who had been waiting for exactly this kind of attention. They read together by lamplight, Clara curled against Louisa's side with the unconscious ease of a child who has decided that this is where she belongs, and Louisa felt something she could not have named precisely, the specific tenderness of loving a child who is not yours by birth but is entirely yours in every other way. By March, she was fairly certain she was expecting. She was absolutely certain by April, when the certainty became impossible to mistake, and she told John on a morning when the world was just beginning to warm and the meadowlarks had come back to the pasture, and everything felt newly alive. His face when she told him was something she kept in memory afterward like a pressed flower, perfect and held exactly as it had been. He said nothing for a moment, just looked at her with his whole heart in his eyes, and then he said, "Are you well? Are you feeling well?" She laughed because that was so completely him. The first question was for her and not for his own feelings about the news. "I am very well," she said. "I am extraordinary, in fact." He kissed her so thoroughly that she had to push him back eventually and remind him that Oscar was likely to arrive at any moment. Clara was told that afternoon, and she received the news with a gravity that lasted approximately 30 seconds before she announced that she wanted a brother. "We do not get to decide that," John told her. "I know," Clara said, clearly implying that she intended to influence the outcome through force of will. The summer of 1879 was the best summer Louisa could remember. The ranch was productive, the cattle coming in at good weight, and John had started talking about expanding the herd in the spring. The store continued to be the center of Redrock Crossing's commercial life, and Pearl had grown into the manager's role so fully that the establishment ran with a reliability that made Louisa more proud than she would have expected. She had received, through the marshal's office, a partial list of families defrauded by her father. She had been writing letters since February, careful and honest letters that explained who she was and what she knew about what her father had done, and that offered, in whatever small way she could, to be of assistance. Some of the letters had not been answered. Several had come back from undeliverable addresses. But 3 had resulted in correspondence, and one of those correspondences had connected her with a family in Galveston, Texas, a freedman named James Hollies and his wife, who had been defrauded of their savings by her father in 1872 and were still attempting to rebuild. She had sent them money, the most she could send without compromising the store's operating stability, and James Hollies had written back a letter that she read and then folded carefully and put in the small box she kept in the top of the wardrobe, the box that contained the things she needed to keep. It was not fixing what her father had done, but it was not nothing. She told John about the letters and the box, and he asked to read James Hollies' letter, and she gave it to him, and he read it and then sat quietly for a moment with the letter in his hands. "You should keep doing this," he said. "I intend to," she said. "Whatever you need from me for it," he said. "Whatever I have." This was, she thought, the particular quality of John Holloway that she had understood from the beginning but had not wanted to admit was moving her so completely. He was a man who gave. Not in the showy way of men who give because giving is a performance, but in the quiet, consistent way of a man who considers what those he loves need, and then simply provides it, without needing credit or acknowledgement. She loved him for it with a specificity and a fullness that she had not thought she was capable of when she arrived in Redrock Crossing on a stage from the east with $43 and a secret. Their son was born in November of 1879, on a cold night when the wind off the plateau rattled the newly hung curtains, and the fire in the hearth was the center of the world. He was born with a great deal of black hair and the healthy, outraged lungs of a child who has been disturbed in the middle of something and wants everyone to know it. Clara, who had apparently been prepared to be gracious about a girl but who was clearly deeply gratified by the vindication of her preference, declared him perfect. John held his son for the first time with the specific tenderness of a man who has been given something he was afraid to hope for, and Louisa watched him hold the baby, and felt a happiness that was so complete and so without edges that she almost did not know what to do with it. They named him William Holloway, after John's father, and they called him Will, and from the first week of his life, he was the subject of Clara's devoted and occasionally overbearing attention. The years that followed were not without their difficulties. Ranching in West Texas in the 1880s was an enterprise that required constant adaptation. The weather was never quite what you needed it to be. The cattle market had its bad years as well as its good ones, and the expanding railroad lines were changing the economics of the region in ways that required John and Oscar to think carefully about where the ranch was positioned. There was a drought in 1880 that was genuinely frightening. 2 months of relentless summer sun with no rain and the east pasture going brown and the water in the creek dropping to a trickle. And John and Louisa sat at the kitchen table in the evenings going over the figures with the focused seriousness of people who have built something and intend to keep it. They got through the drought. They sold a portion of the herd earlier than planned to avoid feeding a number of animals through a grassless summer, and they were careful with every penny. And by September the rains came back and the pasture greened up again, and the creek rose and the crisis passed. Oscar, who had watched the whole of it with the calm of a man who has seen worse, told John afterward that he had handled it well. "Louisa handled it," John said, without false modesty. "You both did," Oscar said. By 1881, the Talbot General Store had been renamed, at Pearl's suggestion, the Holloway Trading Company, a change that Louisa had been slightly sentimental about but had agreed to because the name felt right. It was about who she was now as much as who she had been when she arrived. Pearl, who was 20 by that point and had been running the establishment with considerable skill for 2 years, had also begun to talk about whether she might be in a position to eventually buy into the business, a conversation that Louisa received with genuine pleasure and put seriously on the table. She had not forgotten about the defrauded families in her father's case. She had continued the letter writing and the small financial transfers, and over 3 years she had managed to send meaningful assistance to 6 families. It was not restitution on the scale that justice would have required, but it was what she could do, and she did it. Her father remained in federal prison. She did not write to him and he did not write to her, and she spent no significant amount of emotional energy on him. He had made his choices and was living in their consequences, and she had made hers, and hers had led her here. Will was walking and then running by the time he was 14 months, which Clara considered a personal achievement and which Oscar pointed out was simply what children did. He had John's dark hair and Louisa's green eyes, which Clara considered the most interesting possible combination, and he was a fearless, cheerful child who approached the world with a confidence that made his father laugh. Clara was 9 in September of 1881, and she had grown into a person of formidable character and genuine sweetness, the combination that is the best possible outcome of intelligence paired with empathy. She was the best reader in the territorial school, which she managed without condescension, and she had made it her personal mission to help 3 classmates who were struggling with their letters, which she did with the quiet, purposeful patience of a natural teacher. Louisa and John sat on the porch in the evening, after the children were asleep and Oscar had gone to his cabin, and the ranch settled into its nighttime quiet. And these evenings were among the most precious things Louisa had accumulated in the years since she had come west with nothing. They talked about the future on those evenings, about what they wanted for Clara and Will, about whether the territorial schools would improve with statehood, about what kind of people they hoped their children would grow into. They talked about Oscar and what they could do to ensure he was comfortable as he got older, a thing both of them cared about without needing to make it explicit. They talked about the store and the ranch and the slow, grinding, fascinating work of building a life in a place that was still becoming itself. And sometimes they did not talk at all, just sat together in the dark with the coyotes calling from the hills and the stars doing their vast and indifferent business overhead, and let the silence be what it was, proof of a peace that neither of them had entirely believed they would get. In the spring of 1882, they received a letter from Clara's teacher, Mrs. Hewitt, who wrote to say that Clara had demonstrated exceptional aptitude and that there was a school in San Antonio, a proper school for young women, that Clara would be eligible for in 2 years when she turned 10. The letter was written with obvious care and genuine advocacy, and Louisa and John read it together and then looked at each other. "She would have to board there," John said. "She is Clara," Louisa said. "She would manage it and she would probably run the place within a month." John smiled, but she could see the thing behind the smile that was not quite ready to think about Clara being far away. "We have 2 years," Louisa said. "We do not need to decide now." "But you think she should go," John said. Louisa was quiet for a moment. "I think she deserves to go anywhere she is capable of going, and she is capable of going quite a lot of places." He nodded slowly. "She is like you in that way." "She is like herself," Louisa said, "which is much better than being like anyone else." In the summer of 1882, Louisa discovered she was expecting again. She told John with the particular pleasure of someone delivering news that she knew would be received well, and it was. Will was 2.5 by then, mobile and vocal and deeply interested in everything, and the news that he was going to have a sibling was delivered to him in terms that he seemed to accept without strong opinions. Clara, who was now 9.5 and had developed a philosophical relationship with fate, said thoughtfully, "I hope it is a girl this time." "We still do not get to decide," John said. "I know," Clara said, in exactly the same tone she had used when Will was on the way, clearly indicating that she was once again going to attempt to influence the outcome. This time, as it happened, Clara got her wish. Louis's daughter was born in February of 1883, smaller than Will had been but no less loud, with Louis's coloring and a look of focused determination about her, from the first hour of her life that made both her parents look at each other, and then at Clara and say nothing, because nothing needed to be said. They named her Ellen, after John's first wife, which was a choice that Louisa had suggested, and John had received with a silence that was full of everything, gratitude and grief and love all pressed together in the way they had lived side by side in him since November of 1876. Clara was the one who cried, which surprised everyone, including Clara. "Good tears," she said firmly, wiping her face with the sleeve of her dress. "These are the good kind." And they were. Oscar held the baby on the second day of her life and looked down at her with the expression of a man who had not expected to find himself, at 63, with something this new and this small and this full of possibility in his arms, and he said very quietly, "She is going to give you trouble." "All the best ones do," Louisa said. He looked up at her, and in his eyes she saw the particular warmth of a man who considers himself to have been given something he did not deserve and is grateful for it every day. "You are good for him," he said. "You are good for all of them." She had thought when she came to Redrock Crossing that she was done with being good for anyone. She had thought that what she needed was a place to exist quietly, without danger, without debt, without the constant weight of her father's shadow. She had thought that what she was doing was surviving. She had not thought she was arriving somewhere. The spring of 1883 was gentle. The rains came on schedule, the pasture greened up early, and the cattle that John had built the herd back to through 3 years of careful husbandry moved through the east pasture in the good light like a moving painting of everything a working ranch was supposed to look like. Louisa walked out to the fence line on a Saturday morning in April with Ellen in her arms, and Will toddling alongside her with the careful concentration of a 3-year-old who has decided he can walk long distances, but is not yet entirely sure. Clara had ridden ahead on her small bay horse, which she handled with the confident ease of a child who has grown up around horses and has decided they are friends rather than tools. John was at the fence, like he had been the evening she first walked out to tell him the truth about herself, and he looked up when he heard them coming and watched them cross the pasture toward him with a look on his face that she had seen enough times by now to know perfectly. It was the look he got when he looked at his family. She reached the fence, and he came through the gate and took Ellen from her arms in the automatic way of a man who has become a parent a second time and finds it as natural as breathing. And Will grabbed his father's boot and demanded to be picked up also, which John managed while still holding Ellen, which was an impressive logistical achievement that he accomplished without apparent effort. Clara circled back on her horse and watched her father holding a baby and a toddler simultaneously and said, with the comprehensive satisfaction of someone surveying a life that has come together in the way they wanted it to, "Look at us." "Look at us," Louisa agreed. John caught her eye over the heads of the children, and the expression on his face was the same one she had been thinking about since a December evening on the road to the ranch, when the mesa was on fire in the late light, and he had told her that he wanted to spend whatever years he had left in this world making a life with her. This was the life. Not perfect, because nothing was, because the drought had happened and would probably happen again, because Clara was going to leave for San Antonio in 2 years, and John was going to find that difficult even though he was proud, because Ellen was going to give them trouble in the ways that the best ones did, because the ranch would have hard years along with the good ones, because the world outside their fence line was still a complicated and often unjust place that required people of conscience to keep doing the work of it. But this was the life. The specific, imperfect, fully lived life that she had not known she was coming to find when she stepped off a stage in a red dust town with $43, and a secret that was finally, entirely, done with. That evening, with the children asleep and the lamp burning low and the April wind soft at the windows behind the gold curtains that caught the light and turned it warm, John said, "Tell me what you are thinking." It was what he said when he could see she was in a particular kind of quiet, the thoughtful kind, the kind that meant she was somewhere in herself, and he never told her what she was thinking or assumed he knew, he asked. She turned to look at him across the kitchen table that they had used every day for over 3 years, that had the mark of Will's first real adventure with a fork along one edge and the coffee ring that no amount of scrubbing had quite gotten out, and she said, "I am thinking that Clara was right." "About what?" he said. "She asked me. The morning she came into the store and told me you had been smiling. She asked me if I was going to let you be happy." Louisa paused. "I think I did not understand until just now that the answer was not just about you." John looked at her steadily. "She was asking me if I was going to let myself be happy too," Louisa said. "And I was so busy thinking about whether it was safe to let you in that I almost missed the answer to the real question." "And what is the answer?" he said. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. "Yes," she said. "I am going to let myself be happy. I am already happy. I think I have been for some time now, and I was just the last one to notice." He turned his hand over and held hers. Outside, the coyotes were doing their nightly business in the hills, and the cattle were settled in the pasture, and Clara was asleep upstairs with her book open across her chest in the way she always fell asleep. And Will was in his room with the small stuffed horse that had been a Christmas gift, and that he had named, with wonderful 3-year-old logic, Horse, and Ellen was in the cradle near the hearth making the small sounds of a very new person breathing in a world that was, so far as she knew, entirely safe and entirely good. John and Louisa sat at their kitchen table in the lamplight, holding hands in the easy and unhurried way of people who have time, who have decided they have time, who have built something worth having time for. And the night went on, as nights do, moving slowly toward the morning where, in a few hours, John Holloway would wake up smiling, and his daughter would see it, and the world would hold everything it was supposed to hold. It was not the end of their story. Stories like theirs did not end, not really. They just continued forward into all the ordinary and extraordinary days of a life fully lived, into Clara's letters from San Antonio, where she was, within a year, doing exactly what Louisa had predicted, into Will's slow growth toward a boy with his father's patience and his mother's sharpness, into Ellen's fierce and delightful character that was entirely her own and resembled nothing so much as a small, unstoppable force of nature, who had arrived in the world with strong opinions and the energy to back them up. Oscar lived to 71, comfortable at the ranch, respected and genuinely loved, and the story of his final years was the story of a man who had been given, late, the family that circumstances had denied him earlier, and who received it with gratitude that he expressed through showing up every morning and doing the work and occasionally saying, to no one in particular, that things had turned out all right. The Holloway Trading Company became one of the most reliable establishments in Redrock Crossing and eventually in the wider region, as the railroad came through and the town grew, and Pearl Davis, who bought her stake in 1884 and became the full proprietor when Louisa formally stepped back in 1886, ran it with a capability that made Louisa proud in the specific way you are proud of something you built, and then gave to someone else who understood it. Richard Beaumont served 6 of his 9 years and died in the federal penitentiary in 1885, which Louisa heard about through a brief letter from the marshal's office. She sat with that news for an afternoon, allowing herself to feel whatever she felt, which was complicated and honest, grief for the father she had never actually had, relief that was not quite clean, and then she put it in the box in the top of the wardrobe alongside James Hollis's letter and the telegram from Marshal Foster and Clara's first letter from San Antonio, and a pressed flower from the meadow where she and John had been married, and she closed the lid. And on the Saturday morning when she walked out to the east pasture with her children, and John came through the gate to meet her, and Clara circled back on her horse to say, look at us as if she had arranged all of it herself, which she had in a way, by walking into a general store with her braids half undone and her 7-year-old wisdom sharp as a knife, and her voice carrying the morning news with the simple, devastating certainty of a child who knows that love is not a complicated thing. It is only the people doing it who make it complicated, and that sometimes all it takes is telling someone the truth. Papa woke up smiling today, and she had looked straight at her. And everything that needed to happen had, from that moment, been already in motion. The ranch glowed in the April morning. The curtains in the window were gold. The children were loud and present and full of a future that had not happened yet. John Holloway held his daughter and his son and looked at his wife across the top of their small, warm heads and Louisa Talbot, who was Louisa Holloway now, who had come to this red dust town at the edge of the plateau with $43 and a secret and had found, entirely against her careful intentions, a home, looked back at him with everything she had, which was, it turned out, more than enough, which had always been more than enough, which was, in the end, the whole story.